The scripture this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew, which we are working our way through. Chapter 13, verses 24 to 35. And then I'm going to jump ahead because in the middle, Jesus explains one of the parables, and I don't like when the parables are explained. So, because I think it's important for us to understand them for ourselves. So we jump ahead from 43 to 46. Hear now the word of the Lord. He, that would be Jesus, put before them another parable.
The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." The slaves said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, 'Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'"
And he put before them another parable.
The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches.
And he told them another parable.
The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened.
Jesus told the crowd all these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. "I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world."
Let anyone with ears listen. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it.
Thanks be to God. Jesus was a rabbi, that's a teacher, and he taught often by using parables. Now, parables, particularly when he's talking about something mysterious, like this kingdom or dominion of God and what it is like. The word parable comes from the Greek, and it's like a parallel. Something's parallel. There's running alongside each other. And so it's 2 stories running alongside each other. You know, the story that Jesus told, and then the story, how we connect it to our lives. And so often with parables, people want to make them into analogies to say the enemy who goes and scatters those seeds in the night in the field, well, of course, that's Satan. And then the good people, the wheat, well, those are the people of God, right? And you take and you line them all up and you create this story. Well, that is one way that you can interpret parables, but I think that it's something we want to resist because that makes it too easy. And one of the things about parables is they should not be easy. If you've interpreted a parable and you are comfortable with it, if you're feeling good, then you've probably missed the point. The other thing is, if you ever think you've got it and you've got the right solution, the right meaning of it, you might be right for that moment in time for yourself. But one of the gifts of the parables is that every time you read it, you can interpret it differently. Different people can find different meanings within them. And it is the gift of the parables that each person can find their own meaning within it. But even there's a problem. Amy Jill Levin, who those who came to the Wednesday morning Bible study, we read one of her books on the parables and studied it this fall. She said that a good interpretation of a parable is not to find and seek its meaning. It's to figure out what it's telling you to do. It's not what a parable means, it's what a parable does. You can totally understand the meaning and it won't change your life. But the parables should be transformative and they should move us to action. And every parable, as I said, is going to have a twist, and it's somewhere that makes you uncomfortable. And I think the story that I want to focus on today, of the parables that Jesus told in this, thank you all to read it. That was a lot of parables, bum, 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 bum. The one with the weeds and the wheat. The uncomfortable piece of that is being told those weeds aren't going to go away. They're going to grow up right alongside you, and you're just going to have to live with it. God's not going to do anything about it. You're going to have to wait and grow together with the evil one right there alongside you. This parable doesn't focus, however, on the identity of who this evil one was. If you don't like your neighbor, you're going to go sow seeds in their field. Wouldn't it be a lot easier just to burn it down, to take the time to go along and plant all these seeds along, right? Probably not meant to be taken literally. The parable is not focusing on this outside enemy. But the parable is focusing on the two potential responses to this idea that evil is mixed with good. And so what is our response going to be? Well, in the parable, the first response comes from the slaves or the servants. It's the same word there in the Greek, who want to know if the householder inadvertently sowed the bad seed. It's like, you sowed the good seed, didn't you, boss? And if you didn't, if you accidentally sowed this bad seed, wouldn't you like us to go and get it out of the field for you? And the other response to this evil in the field is that of the householder, who says, wait, and live with this paradox. And that's not the response we want to hear, is it? Wouldn't we like it if someone would just come and pluck up and take away those things in our lives that we don't like, that we don't want to be there right alongside of us? One of the problems with that interpretation is we think that we're the wheat. Somebody come pluck and take away these bad things. Oh, whoa, wait a minute. When my husband and I were first married, we lived in an apartment in Southern California. And we had a little balcony. And the only place that I could garden, and I loved to garden, was pots on my patio. And so when we moved back to Virginia, and we moved into a townhouse with a, townhouse backyard, not very big, but it was actual ground that I could garden in, and I was so excited. Well, we moved in October as stuff is all starting to die off and settle in for the winter. So it wasn't really until the spring that I could start to work in this garden. The problem was I didn't know what had already been planted there. And so I had to wait. And this one thing started growing, and I didn't recognize it. There's something, I recognize a dandelion when I see it. It wasn't a dandelion, but it was something I wasn't sure. And so I let it keep growing, thinking I would recognize it eventually, decide whether this was a flower or a weed. Well, eventually this plant, whatever it was almost as tall as me before it bloomed. And I decided it was a weed. But I had to wait and see for a really long time. Now, my dad, who's an agronomist, will tell me it's not a weed. There's no such thing as a weed. There's no plant whose name is weed. A plant that is somewhere where you don't want it is the definition of a weed. So if I had liked that really tall thing that I waited to see the flowers on, if I had said, oh, I'd like that, let's keep it, it would not have been a weed. So that leads to this idea not only of the story of being told to grow alongside, but this idea of recognizing what is the weed and what is the wheat. And if you harm one, that's what the story gets into, this herbicide, right? Let's just go spray and kill those weeds or pull them up. And you harm the one that is there that is good. This wheat and weed story in the Bible, the weed is actually given a name. It's called darnel. And darnel was described as the devil of a weed. It has no virtues. Its roots surround the roots of the good plant. Actually work around them and then steal the nutrients and steal the water. And of course, water would have been scarce in that part of the world. And that would make it, because the roots were so wrapped around the other roots, it was impossible to pull it out without damaging the good wheat. And above ground, they looked identical until it bare seed, until it bore fruit. And of course, the seeds of wheat, we know, are what we eat in our bread, and we grow for that purpose. But the seeds of the darnel, they could cause everything from hallucinations to death. And you couldn't tell them apart until they were fully grown. So no herbicide allowed. And a parable that's left us with, well, we've got to grow up alongside to this devil of a weed. Where's the good news in this? Because yes, it's a parable, so it's going to make us uncomfortable, but it's also Jesus' words to us, so it's always got to be good news. Pastor Mark Havel, in his sermon on this parable, says, the good news is this: I believe Jesus is trying to free us and to send a message of grace and freedom to the world around us with this parable. I think that freedom comes only when we accept God's call to let go of our desire to judge, to let go of our temptation to take sides, to let go of the ways we pretend to know what's right or wrong, or who's in or who's out where God's love is concerned. We so often assume that it is our job to draw up the specifications regarding the wideness of the church's welcome. How wide really can it be and still be the church? In our impatience with others, we often want to bring matters to a head and so determine whether others are in or out. David Bailey, in his commentary, reminds us that too often we are tempted to act as though it is our responsibility and calling to weed out those who do not belong for one reason or another. Whether they think wrongly about an issue, or espouse the wrong politics, or act in a way we consider outside the lines of Christianity, or just try to keep things stirred up all the time, we come to the conclusion that the church would be a better or purer place without them. Problem is that if we're thinking that way about them, they're probably thinking the same way about us. So which of us would have the better right to do the weeding? Claiming the right has led to all manners of inquisitions and excommunications and church splits and discouraged people just dropping out of church and faith. And whether we do this weeding out of fear or out of love, out of genuine concern or out of ignorance, with all the biblical scholarship and well-reasoned theology or not, Jesus tells us this sort of thing is not our job. In his explanation of the parable, the one I didn't let you see, Jesus tells us that he is the one. The Son of Man will send his angels, he says, and then at the end of the age. And until then, we've got to let it go. It means that we have to leave the weed pulling and the weeping and the gnashing of teeth for another time. This parable teaches us humility and patience and frees us to live the life of faith in a positive manner of inclusivity rather than a negative manner of exclusivity. Dealing with the weeds is not our business, but God's. And the God who is glimpsed in this parable models for us an infinite patience that frees us to get on with the crucial business of loving, or at least living, with each other. And furthermore, we must be careful about the arrogance of too easily identifying ourselves with the wheat in the story. In each of our lives at any given time, there is wheat growing, and there are weeds growing, which are trying to choke out the wheat. In the 7th chapter of his letter to the Romans, Paul agonizes over the power of sin in his life, saying, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. And what was true for Paul is true for all of us, isn't it? And so God's patience is good news for us too. Jesus teaches with this parable that now is the time for something altogether different, where grace and mercy and peace are concerned. Now is the time for planting good seeds of promise, of hope, of faith, and of love. Now is a time for growing together. Now is a time for growing alongside. Now is a time for being the good seed that grows and bears fruit in spite of whatever weeds might threaten or challenge or scare us along the way. It's not what the parable means. It's what the parable does. It calls us not to pull out the herbicide and the Roundup, but to live alongside. And that is hard and holy work for sure. But it's something a lot more like the gospel. And it's God's call to us for the sake of the world. Thanks be to God. Amen.